Welcome back. In this lecture on human communication and culture, we're going to focus briefly on what is culture and the importance of communication, the necessity of communication in the development of culture. What kind of culture do humans have relative to animal cultures? And then we'll move into a slight digression, really, to think about human communication and how language may have evolved, because it's just pretty fascinating, a pretty fascinating topic, and how it may contribute to the differences we see in human culture compared to animal culture. So let's move to our PowerPoint. This is our PowerPoint. Human communication and culture. We're reading for this lecture the Agile Gene 209 through 222. And so we might ask ourselves, well, what is culture? And think about the relationship between communication and culture. There are lots of definitions for what is culture. Culture can be defined as the whole range of learned behavior patterns that a group exhibits. There are other definitions here. Culture can be thought of as the adoption and transmission of one or more behaviors in a group, the transmission of a tradition from generation to generation. Or here's another one, the spread of information or a tradition or the spread of a behavior from one individual to another via communication. Because clearly communication is the way that culture can grow. Communication is critical to the development of culture, right? And one type of communication, verbal communication, is a defining feature of human culture. And so when we think about human and animal cultures, well, let's ask the question, do you think animals even have culture? Can they spread information or traditions or behavior from one generation to the next or from one individual to another? Is there evidence for this? Well, we'll ask that question. But before we do, I forgot, we'll think about culture in human societies. Think about the things that are cultural traditions in virtually all human societies. So we've got things like we classify people into gender categories or age categories. We raise our children in kind of family settings. We have rules about sexual behavior, or norms, if you will. We have rules or norms about social behavior. We can distinguish good from bad. We make jokes. We play games. We have art. We have body ornamentation. We have different kinds of traditional foods and pastimes like sports and hobbies. We have holidays and festivals, and we all have leaders. All human societies have leaders who make decisions. These are all a part of our culture. And communication, especially language, has made invaluable contributions to our culture, right? Well, what about animals? Do other animals exhibit culture? And I'd like you to watch this. It's about a 5-minute video on animal culture. This is the link down here on the bottom right. Click on that, take you to a short video on animal culture, but you bet, research is showing now that animals do seem to have culture. They have traditions that are passed from one generation to the next, or they can pass information from one animal to another. The type of culture is when we compare humans to animals, it's likely that animal cultures are different by degree. Humans have the ability to accumulate culture. There's a cumulative effect of culture, and that is because of, we think, language, because of verbal communication. But let's think about some examples of animal cultures. Researchers discovered in the 1900s, mid-1900s, late 1900s, I can't remember, that chimpanzees living in different populations have different patterns of learned behaviors. So chimpanzees would use tools from different populations, would use tools in different ways, would hunt differently, would take care of their young in different ways, right? And each population had its own traditions. Culture, right? Humpback whales have culture. The humpback whales exhibit what's a fishing method that's called bubble feeding, where they blow bubbles, and that contributes to kind of, I don't know, making it, maybe confuses the fish that they're hunting. But now there's a new tradition that's shown up, and it's spread quite rapidly to something like 30% of the populations. It's called lobtail feeding. Lobtail feeding is when, at the beginning of a feed, the humpback whale will strike the surface of the water with its tail and then start blowing bubbles. Apparently, this helps to get a particular fish that is more abundant now than it was, kind of it gets them all herded together, so it's easier to capture them, according to the information that I've read. So and this tradition is now being spread throughout populations. And another study that was done specifically to look for culture, it was done with these vervet monkeys. It's a little picture down at the bottom there. The vervet monkeys were trained to to eat either pink or blue corn, because the researchers made one color of the corn bitter tasting. And this, once one individual had learned the task, soon the whole troop had learned the task, including the young of the troop. And so if the individual learns that pink is bitter, blue is better, then even when pink isn't bitter anymore, you see the population of vervets preferring blue. Why they prefer blue? Because they've learned that pink was bitter at one time, and that information has been passed along. That's an exhibition of culture. Animals have culture. It may be different in degree, in part because, or in large part because humans have language or verbal communication. Animals don't have that language ability. Okay, so let's think about nonverbal and verbal communication. Both nonverbal and verbal communication are mechanisms for sending information from a signaler to a receiver, and usually both of the individuals benefit, right? That's what communication is. Both of these is a way to pass along information. In nonverbal communication, we're thinking about, oops, I've got to move on, thinking about, in humans, let's start thinking about what kinds of nonverbal communications we make. We do all sorts of things nonverbally. We send and receive wordless messages through our facial expressions, right? Our eye contact. If we smile or frown, the way we use our eyebrows. If you're wearing a mask, it's all about the eyes, right? From touching. We give a hug. We give a high five. We do a side hug. Apparently my daughter thinks side hugs, my 12-year-old is like, that's what she likes to do. I think side hugs are weak, but whatever. We do gestures, thumbs up, peace, we have body language, the way we hold ourselves, our posture, our positioning. We communicate nonverbally through objects, our hairstyles, what we're wearing. We have something called para-language, our voice quality, our tone, our rhythm, our speaking style can communicate without the words something about us. We use dance. The elements of written text, our handwriting, the spatial arrangement of words are a part of nonverbal communication. It's interesting to even think about how emailing or texting takes information out of that, takes nonverbal information away from us, compared to the written text, the handwritten text. In any case, a huge chunk of our communication is nonverbal. And the functions of nonverbal in communication in humans could include things like the expression of our emotions, right? Our facial expressions, our gestures, our ability to express interpersonal attitudes, how I feel about you, my facial expressions, my tone, my touch can really tell you how I feel about you, right? We use nonverbal communication in rituals, especially greetings, hugs, and kisses, and handshakes, and smiles, and things of that nature. We use nonverbal communication in interaction between a speaker and a listener. I'm missing all that information as I give these prepared lectures, right? I'm not cueing in on you at all, and that's hard. It's hard to know how my lecture is going, if you will. Nonverbal communication can be used to help us present our personality or to present our emotions, right? What do we like? Nonverbal communication interacts with verbal communication too. Sometimes it strengthens it. Sometimes it conflicts with our verbal message. People who are on the autism spectrum don't communicate very well non-verbally or have more trouble with that kind of communication, and it's harder for them to read and understand it. But it's a huge part of our communication. However, verbal communication is probably why our culture is the way it is, why we have so much culture relative to animals, if you will. Verbal communication is, by definition, the process of sending and receiving messages with words, whether those words are written or signed or verbalized or spoken. Verbal communication is language, written or spoken or communicated with gesture. Okay? Verbal communication includes a system of symbols and grammar or rules by which to manipulate the symbols. The symbols might be a pattern of sound, spoken language, a gesture in sign language, a written symbol in written language. There are thousands of human languages, but they all share similarities or similar properties. And with language, we can express ourselves in an infinite variety of ways. We can express separate, distinct thoughts that are hard or impossible to express without verbal communication. Now, I've included sign language as a language. It truly is a language that uses a system of symbols and rules, and that uses words in sending messages, and that's why it's considered a language, right? Well, what are the advantages of language over nonverbal communication? Why is it better? Well, we can think of a lot of advantages. We certainly can use verbal communication to communicate in the dark and around obstacles. Verbal communication, at least in the spoken verbal communication, frees up our hands for other uses. So instead of using gestures all the time, we can use our hands to be doing other things while communicating verbally. It allows us to communicate about any idea, not just about the present, but we can communicate about the past, about the future. We can communicate about fantasies, just things that aren't real. There's just no limitations with verbal communication. Gestures, nonverbal communication is more limited, right? Do other animals have language? This is a really debatable question. I have written down here no, but I'm going to leave it a little bit more up in the air. Some animals can use symbols to represent actions. I think a lot of animals can use symbols in different ways, from dolphins and whales and chimps and other primates. But I think most language specialists would say that other animals don't have true language in the complexity of language that we have. In any case, let's think about, in this part of the lecture, let's think about how language could have evolved, right? How did it evolve? So first we'll look at the biology of language, and then we'll look at this hypothesis about how language could have evolved. And I'll talk briefly about the biology of language first. So this is also described pretty carefully in Ridley text, so you might want to read that text as well. But here are some things we know about language, the biology of language. First of all, we know that in people who are right-handed, language is lateralized into the left hemisphere of the brain. For something like 98% of right-handers have have most of their language function comes from the right hemisphere. And we know this from people who've had strokes or people who've had other kinds of trauma to the brain, and how that affects their language, their ability to talk and to comprehend language as well. People who are left-handed, like me, have a much less lateralized brain. And yeah, it's kind of interesting. Oh, by the way, the non-dominant hemisphere is often involved in determining the emotional state of the speaker. It's involved in appreciating humor and metaphor, and so obviously it plays a role in language and understanding language also. But we do see a lateralization. Second thing is there's an area of the cerebral cortex, that's that outer layer of the brain, right, that has all of these what are called gyruses or gyri and bumps, humps on the brain, right? Broca's area was discovered to be an important region of the brain, of the cerebral cortex in the frontal lobe of the brain, that is important in the production of language. This person named Paul Broca in the early 1800s discovered that he had two patients that had a lot of trouble with producing language, not so much understanding it, and he found that they had damage in this area of their brain. It's also important in motor-related processes like gesture making, and that's going to be important later. The second area of the brain that seems to be really important in language is the Wernicke's area, also in the cerebral cortex, but this time in the superior temporal gyrus. So on a part of the temporal lobe of the brain. It's called Wernicke's area, named after the person who kind of discovered this in 1874, I guess, so late in the 1800s. And this particular region of the brain is important in language comprehension. Someone who has a stroke in this region of the brain has a lot more trouble understanding a conversation. And when they produce language, it's fluent. They can speak in sentences that are grammatical, but they often use words that don't fit together. They will say things that no one else quite really understands what they mean because their word use is incorrect. But comprehension is, and they don't even know that they're using it incorrectly. This is called, when someone has a problem in this area of the brain and has trouble with language, we would call it Wernicke's aphasia. Aphasia is a language problem, right? And then there's communication between the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. There's a lot of communication, which makes sense if you're dealing with an area of the brain that produces language, an area of the brain that comprehends language. We need to have communication between them, obviously. Okay, let's talk about the hypothesis for the evolution of language in the next video. Let's get out of here.